The Moonstone, Part 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, read by Graham Redman. Chapter 11. When the last of the guests had driven away, I went back into the inner hall and found Samuel at the side table, presiding over the brandy and soda water. My lady and Miss Rachel came out of the drawing-room, followed by the two gentlemen. Mr. Godfrey had some brandy and soda water. Mr. Franklin took nothing. He sat down looking dead tired. The talking on this birthday occasion had, I suppose, been too much for him. My lady, turning round to wish them good night, looked hard at the wicked Colonel's legacy shining in her daughter's dress. "Rachel," she asked, "where are you going to put your diamond tonight?" Miss Rachel was in high good spirits, just in that humour for talking nonsense, and perversely persisting in it as if it was sense, which you may sometimes have observed in young girls when they are highly wrought up at the end of an exciting day. First, she declared she didn't know where to put the diamond. Then she said, on her dressing-table, of course, along with her other things. Then she remembered that the diamond might take to shining of itself with its awful moony light in the dark, and that would terrify her in the dead of night. Then she bethought herself of an Indian cabinet which stood in her sitting-room, and instantly made up her mind to put the Indian diamond in the Indian cabinet for the purpose of permitting two beautiful native productions to admire each other. Having let her little flow of nonsense run on as far as that point, her mother interposed and stopped her. "My dear, your Indian cabinet has no lock to it," says my lady. "Good heavens, mamma!" cried Miss Rachel. "Is this an hotel? Are there thieves in the house?" Without taking notice of this fantastic way of talking, my lady wished the gentleman good night. She next turned to Miss Rachel and kissed her. "Why not let me keep the diamond for you tonight?" she asked. Miss Rachel received that proposal as she might 10 years since have received a proposal to part her from a new doll. My lady saw there was no reasoning with her that night. "Come into my room, Rachel, the first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "I shall have something to say to you." With those last words she left us slowly, thinking her own thoughts and, to all appearance, not best pleased with the way by which they were leading her. Miss Rachel was the next to say good night. She shook hands first with Mr. Godfrey, who was standing at the other end of the hall looking at a picture. Then she turned back to Mr. Franklin, still sitting weary and silent in a corner. What words passed between them I can't say, but standing near the old oak frame which holds our large looking-glass, I saw her reflected in it, slyly slipping the locket which Mr. Franklin had given to her out of the bosom of her dress and showing it to him for a moment with a smile, which certainly meant something out of the common, before she tripped off to bed. This incident staggered me a little in the reliance I had previously felt on my own judgment. I began to think that Penelope might be right about the state of her young lady's affections after all. As soon as Miss Rachel left him eyes to see with, Mr. Franklin noticed me. His variable humour, shifting about everything, had shifted about the Indians already. "Betteridge," he said, "I'm half inclined to think I took Mr. Murthwaite too seriously when we had that talk in the shrubbery. I wonder whether he has been trying any of his traveller's tales on us. Do you really mean to let the dogs loose?" "I'll relieve them of their collars, sir," I answered, "and leave them free to take a turn in the night if they smell a reason for it." "All right," says Mr. Franklin, "we'll see what is to be done tomorrow. I am not at all disposed to alarm my aunt, Betteridge, without a very pressing reason for it. Good night." He looked so worn and pale as he nodded to me and took his candle to go upstairs that I ventured to advise his having a drop of brandy and water by way of nightcap. Mr. Godfrey, walking towards us from the other end of the hall, backed me. He pressed Mr. Franklin in the friendliest manner to take something before he went to bed. I only note these trifling circumstances because, after all I had seen and heard that day, it pleased me to observe that our two gentlemen were on just as good terms as ever. Their warfare of words, heard by Penelope in the drawing-room, and their rivalry for the best place in Miss Rachel's good graces seemed to have set no serious difference between them. But there, they were both good-tempered and both men of the world, and there is certainly this merit in people of station, that they are not nearly so quarrelsome among each other as people of no station at all. Mr. Franklin declined the brandy and water, and went upstairs with Mr. Godfrey, their rooms being next door to each other. On the landing, however, either his cousin persuaded him, or he veered about and changed his mind as usual. "P'r'aps I may want it in the night," he called down to me. "Send up some brandy and water into my room." I sent up Samuel with the brandy and water, and then went out and unbuckled the dogs' collars. They both lost their heads with astonishment on being set loose at that time of night, and jumped upon me like a couple of puppies. However, the rain soon cooled them down again. They lapped a drop of water each and crept back into their kennels. As I went into the house I noticed signs in the sky which betokened a break in the weather for the better. For the present it still poured heavily, and the ground was in a perfect sop. Samuel and I went all over the house, and shut up as usual. I examined everything myself, and trusted nothing to my deputy on this occasion. All was safe and fast when I rested my old bones in bed between midnight and 1 in the morning. The worries of the day had been a little too much for me, I suppose. At any rate, I had a touch of Mr. Franklin's malady that night. It was sunrise before I fell off at last into a sleep. All the time I lay awake the house was as quiet as the grave. Not a sound stirred but the splash of the rain and the sighing of the wind among the trees as a breeze sprang up with the morning. About 7:30 I woke and opened my window on a fine sunshiny day. The clock had struck 8, and I was just going out to chain up the dogs again when I heard a sudden whisking of petticoats on the stairs behind me. I turned about, and there was Penelope flying down after me like mad. "Father," she screamed, "come upstairs, for God's sake! The diamond is gone!" "Are you out of your mind?" I asked her. "Gone," said Penelope, "gone, nobody knows how. Come up and see." She dragged me after her into our young lady's sitting-room, which opened into her bedroom. There, on the threshold of her bedroom door, stood Miss Rachel, almost as white in the face as the white dressing-gown that clothed her. There also stood the 2 doors of the Indian cabinet, wide open. One of the drawers inside was pulled out as far as it would go. "Look," says Penelope, "I myself saw Miss Rachel put the diamond into that drawer last night." I went to the cabinet. The drawer was empty. "Is this true, miss?" I asked. With a look that was not like herself, with a voice that was not like her own, Miss Rachel answered, as my daughter had answered, "The diamond is gone." Having said those words, she withdrew into her bedroom and shut and locked the door. Before we knew which way to turn next, my lady came in, hearing my voice in her daughter's sitting-room, and wondering what had happened. The news of the loss of the diamond seemed to petrify her. She went straight to Miss Rachel's bedroom and insisted on being admitted. Miss Rachel let her in. The alarm, running through the house like fire, caught the 2 gentlemen next. Mr. Godfrey was the first to come out of his room. All he did when he heard what had happened was to hold up his hands in a state of bewilderment, which didn't say much for his natural strength of mind. Mr. Franklin, whose clear head I had confidently counted on to advise us, seemed to be as helpless as his cousin when he heard the news in his turn. For a wonder, he had had a good night's rest at last, and the unaccustomed luxury of sleep had, as he said himself, apparently stupefied him. However, when he had swallowed his cup of coffee, which he always took on the foreign plan some hours before he ate any breakfast, his brains brightened. The clear-headed side of him turned up, and he took the matter in hand resolutely and cleverly, much as follows. He first sent for the servants, and told them to leave all the lower doors and windows, with the exception of the front door which I had opened, exactly as they had been left when we locked up overnight. He next proposed to his cousin and to me to make quite sure, before we took any further steps, that the diamond had not accidentally dropped somewhere out of sight, say at the back of the cabinet, or down behind the table on which the cabinet stood. Having searched in both places and found nothing, having also questioned Penelope and discovered from her no more than the little she had already told me, Mr. Franklin suggested next extending our inquiries to Miss Rachel, and sent Penelope to knock at her bedroom door. My lady answered the knock, and closed the door behind her. The moment after, we heard it locked inside by Miss Rachel. My mistress came out among us, looking sorely puzzled and distressed. "The loss of the diamond seems to have quite overwhelmed Rachel," she said in reply to Mr. Franklin. "She shrinks in the strangest manner from speaking of it, even to me. It is impossible you can see her for the present." Having added to our perplexities by this account of Miss Rachel, my lady, after a little effort, recovered her usual composure, and acted with her usual decision. "I suppose there is no help for it," she said quietly. "I suppose I have no alternative but to send for the police." "And the first thing for the police to do," added Mr. Franklin, catching her up, "is to lay hands on the Indian jugglers who performed here last night." My lady and Mr. Godfrey, not knowing what Mr. Franklin and I knew, both started, and both looked surprised. "I can't stop to explain myself now," Mr. Franklin went on. "I can only tell you that the Indians have certainly stolen the diamond. Give me a letter of introduction," says he, addressing my lady, "to one of the magistrates at Frizinghall, merely telling him that I represent your interests and wishes, and let me ride off with it instantly. Our chance of catching the thieves may depend on our not wasting one unnecessary minute." Nota bene, whether it was the French side or the English, the right side of Mr. Franklin seemed to be uppermost now. The only question was, how long would it last? He put pen, ink, and paper before his aunt, who, as it appeared to me, wrote the letter he wanted a little unwillingly. If it had been possible to overlook such an event as the loss of a jewel worth £20,000, I believe, with my lady's opinion of her late brother, and her distrust of his birthday gift, it would have been privately a relief to her to let the thieves get off with the Moonstone scot-free. I went out with Mr. Franklin to the stables, and took the opportunity of asking him how the Indians, whom I suspected, of course, as shrewdly as he did, could possibly have got into the house. "One of them might have slipped into the hall in the confusion when the dinner company were going away," says Mr. Franklin. "The fellow may have been under the sofa while my aunt and Rachel were talking about where the diamond was to be put for the night. He would only have to wait till the house was quiet, and there it would be in the cabinet to be had for the taking." With those words he called to the groom to open the gate, and galloped off. This seemed certainly to be the only rational explanation, but how had the thief contrived to make his escape from the house? I had found the front door locked and bolted as I had left it at night, when I went to open it after getting up. As for the other doors and windows, there they were still, all safe and fast, to speak for themselves. The dogs too? Suppose the thief had got away by dropping from one of the upper windows, how had he escaped the dogs? Had he come provided for them with drugged meat? As the doubt crossed my mind, the dogs themselves came galloping at me round a corner, rolling each other over on the wet grass in such lively health and spirits that it was with no small difficulty I brought them to reason, and chained them up again. The more I turned it over in my mind, the less satisfactory Mr. Franklin's explanation appeared to be. We had our breakfasts. Whatever happens in a house, robbery or murder, it doesn't matter, you must have your breakfast. When we had done, my lady sent for me, and I found myself compelled to tell her all that I had hitherto concealed relating to the Indians and their plot. Being a woman of a high courage, she soon got over the first startling effect of what I had to communicate. Her mind seemed to be far more perturbed about her daughter than about the heathen rogues and their conspiracy. "You know how odd Rachel is, and how differently she behaves sometimes from other girls," my lady said to me. "But I have never in all my experience seen her so strange and so reserved as she is now. The loss of her jewel seems almost to have turned her brain. Who would have thought that horrible diamond could have laid such a hold on her in so short a time?" It was certainly strange. Taking toys and trinkets in general, Miss Rachel was nothing like so mad after them as most young girls. Yet there she was, still locked up inconsolably in her bedroom. It is but fair to add that she was not the only one of us in the house who was thrown out of the regular groove. Mr. Godfrey, for instance, though professionally a sort of consoler general, seemed to be at a loss where to look for his own resources. Having no company to amuse him, and getting no chance of trying what his experience of women in distress could do towards comforting Miss Rachel, he wandered hither and thither about the house and gardens in an aimless, uneasy way. He was in two different minds about what it became him to do after the misfortune that had happened to us. Ought he to relieve the family, in their present situation, of the responsibility of him as a guest, or ought he to stay on the chance that even his humble services might be of some use? He decided ultimately that the last course was perhaps the most customary and considerate course to take in such a very peculiar case of family distress as this was. Circumstances try the mettle a man is really made of. Mr. Godfrey, tried by circumstances, showed himself of weaker mettle than I had thought him to be. As for the women servants, excepting Rosanna Spearman, who kept by herself, they took to whispering together in corners and staring at nothing suspiciously, as is the manner of that weaker half of the human family when anything extraordinary happens in a house. I myself acknowledge to have been fidgety and ill-tempered. The cursed Moonstone had turned us all upside down. A little before 11 Mr. Franklin came back. The resolute side of him had, to all appearance, given way in the interval since his departure under the stress that had been laid on it. He had left us at a gallop, he came back to us at a walk. When he went away he was made of iron, when he returned he was stuffed with cotton as limp could be. "Well," says my lady, "are the police coming?" "Yes," says Mr. Franklin, "they said they would follow me in a fly. Superintendent Seagrave, of your local police force, and 2 of his men. A mere form. The case is hopeless." "What? Have the Indians escaped, sir?" I asked. "The poor ill-used Indians have been most unjustly put in prison," says Mr. Franklin. "They are as innocent as the babe unborn. My idea that one of them was hidden in the house has ended, like all the rest of my ideas, in smoke. It's been proved," says Mr. Franklin, dwelling with great relish on his own incapacity, "to be simply impossible." After astonishing us by announcing this totally new turn in the matter of the Moonstone, our young gentleman, at his aunt's request, took a seat and explained himself. It appeared that the resolute side of him had held out as far as Frizinghall. He had put the whole case plainly before the magistrate, and the magistrate had at once sent for the police. The first inquiries instituted about the Indians showed that they had not so much as attempted to leave the town. Further questions addressed to the police proved that all three had been seen returning to Frising Hall with their boy on the previous night between 10 and 11, which, regard being had to hours and distances, also proved that they had walked straight back after performing on our terrace. Later still, at midnight, the police, having occasion to search the common lodging-house where they lived, had seen them all three again, and their little boy with them as usual. Soon after midnight I myself had safely shut up the house. Plainer evidence than this in favour of the Indians there could not well be. The magistrate said there was not even a case of suspicion against them so far, but as it was just possible, when the police came to investigate the matter, that discoveries affecting the jugglers might be made, he would contrive, by committing them as rogues and vagabonds, to keep them at our disposal under lock and key for a week. They had ignorantly done something, I forget what, in the town, which barely brought them within the operation of the law. Every human institution, justice included, will stretch a little if you only pull it the right way. The worthy magistrate was an old friend of my lady's, and the Indians were committed for a week as soon as the court opened that morning. Such was Mr. Franklin's narrative of events at Frising Hall. The Indian clue to the mystery of the lost jewel was now, to all appearance, a clue that had broken in our hands. If the jugglers were innocent, who in the name of wonder had taken the Moonstone out of Miss Rachel's drawer? 10 minutes later, to our infinite relief, Superintendent Seagrave arrived at the house. He reported passing Mr. Franklin on the terrace, sitting in the sun, I suppose with the Italian side of him uppermost, and warning the police as they went by that the investigation was hopeless before the investigation had begun. For a family in our situation, the superintendent of the Frising Hall police was the most comforting officer you could wish to see. Mr. Seagrave was tall and portly, and military in his manners. He had a fine, commanding voice, and a mighty resolute eye, and a grand frock-coat which buttoned beautifully up to his leather stock. "I'm the man you want" was written all over his face, and he ordered his two inferior policemen about with a severity which convinced us all that there was no trifling with him. He began by going round the premises, outside and in, the result of that investigation proving to him that no thieves had broken in upon us from outside, and that the robbery consequently must have been committed by some person in the house. I leave you to imagine the state the servants were in when this official announcement first reached their ears. The superintendent decided to begin by examining the boudoir, and, that done, to examine the servants next. At the same time he posted one of his men on the staircase which led to the servants' bedrooms, with instructions to let nobody in the house pass him till further orders. At this latter proceeding the weaker half of the human family went distracted on the spot. They bounced out of their corners, whisked upstairs in a body to Miss Rachel's room, Rosanna Spearman being carried away among them this time, burst in on Superintendent Seagrave, and, all looking equally guilty, summoned him to say which of them he suspected at once. Mr. Superintendent proved equal to the occasion. He looked at them with his resolute eye, and he cowed them with his military voice. "Now then, you women, go downstairs again, every one of you. I won't have you here. Look," says Mr. Superintendent, suddenly pointing to a little smear of the decorative painting on Miss Rachel's door, at the outer edge just under the lock. "Look what mischief the petticoats of some of you have done already. Clear out! Clear out!" Rosanna Spearman, who was nearest to him and nearest to the little smear on the door, set the example of obedience and slipped off instantly to her work. The rest followed her out. The superintendent finished his examination of the room, and, making nothing of it, asked me who had first discovered the robbery. My daughter had first discovered it. My daughter was sent for. Mr. Superintendent proved to be a little too sharp with Penelope at starting. "Now, young woman, attend to me, and mind you speak the truth." Penelope fired up instantly. "I've never been taught to tell lies, Mr. Policeman, and if father can stand there and hear me accused of falsehood and thieving, and my own bedroom shut against me, and my character taken away, which is all a poor girl has left, he's not the good father I take him for." A timely word from me put Justice and Penelope on a pleasanter footing together. The questions and answers went swimmingly and ended in nothing worth mentioning. My daughter had seen Miss Rachel put the diamond in the drawer of the cabinet the last thing at night. She had gone in with Miss Rachel's cup of tea at 8 the next morning, and had found the drawer open and empty. Upon that she had alarmed the house, and there was an end of Penelope's evidence. Mr. Superintendent next asked to see Miss Rachel herself. Penelope mentioned his request through the door. The answer reached us by the same road. "I have nothing to tell the policeman. I can't see anybody." Our experienced officer looked equally surprised and offended when he heard that reply. I told him my young lady was ill, and begged him to wait a little and see her later. We thereupon went downstairs again, and were met by Mr. Godfrey and Mr. Franklin crossing the hall. The two gentlemen, being inmates of the house, were summoned to say if they could throw any light on the matter. Neither of them knew anything about it. Had they heard any suspicious noises during the previous night? They had heard nothing but the pattering of the rain. Had I, lying awake longer than either of them, heard nothing either? Nothing. Released from examination, Mr. Franklin, still sticking to the helpless view of our difficulty, whispered to me, "That man will be of no earthly use to us. Superintendent Seagrave is an ass." Released in his turn, Mr. Godfrey whispered to me, "Evidently a most competent person. Betteridge, I have the greatest faith in him. Many men, many opinions, as one of the ancients said before my time." Mr. Superintendent's next proceeding took him back to the boudoir again, with my daughter and me at his heels. His object was to discover whether any of the furniture had been moved during the night out of its customary place, his previous investigation in the room having apparently not gone quite far enough to satisfy his mind on this point. While we were still poking about among the chairs and tables, the door of the bedroom was suddenly opened. After having denied herself to everybody, Miss Rachel, to our astonishment, walked into the midst of us of her own accord. She took up her garden hat from a chair, and then went straight to Penelope with this question: "Mr. Franklin Blake sent you with a message to me this morning?" "Yes, miss." "He wished to speak to me, didn't he?" "Yes, miss." "Where is he now?" Hearing voices on the terrace below, I looked out of window and saw the two gentlemen walking up and down together. Answering for my daughter, I said, "Mr. Franklin is on the terrace, miss." Without another word, without heeding Mr. Superintendent, who tried to speak to her, pale as death and wrapped up strangely in her own thoughts, she left the room and went down to her cousins on the terrace. It showed a want of due respect, it showed a breach of good manners on my part, but for the life of me I couldn't help looking out of window when Miss Rachel met the gentleman outside. She went up to Mr. Franklin without appearing to notice Mr. Godfrey, who thereupon drew back and left them by themselves. What she said to Mr. Franklin appeared to be spoken vehemently. It lasted but for a short time, and, judging by what I saw of his face from the window, seemed to astonish him beyond all power of expression. While they were still together, my lady appeared on the terrace. Miss Rachel saw her, said a few last words to Mr. Franklin, and suddenly went back into the house again before her mother came up with her. My lady, surprised herself, and noticing Mr. Franklin's surprise, spoke to him. Mr. Godfrey joined them, and spoke also. Mr. Franklin walked away a little between the two, telling them what had happened, I suppose, for they both stopped short after taking a few steps, like persons struck with amazement. I had just seen as much as this when the door of the sitting-room was opened violently. Miss Rachel walked swiftly through to her bedroom, wild and angry, with fierce eyes and flaming cheeks. Mr. Superintendent once more attempted to question her. She turned round on him at her bedroom door. "I have not sent for you," she cried out vehemently. "I don't want you. My diamond is lost. Neither you nor anybody else will ever find it." With those words she went in and locked the door in our faces. Penelope, standing nearest to it, heard her burst out crying the moment she was alone again. In a rage one moment, in tears the next. What did it mean? I told the superintendent it meant that Miss Rachel's temper was upset by the loss of her jewel. Being anxious for the honour of the family, it distressed me to see my young lady forget herself even with a police officer, and I made the best excuse I could accordingly. In my own private mind I was more puzzled by Miss Rachel's extraordinary language and conduct than words can tell. Taking what she had said at her bedroom door as a guide to guess by, I could only conclude that she was mortally offended by our sending for the police, and that Mr. Franklin's astonishment on the terrace was caused by her having expressed herself to him, as the person chiefly instrumental in fetching the police, to that effect. If this guess was right, why, having lost her diamond, should she object to the presence in the house of the very people whose business it was to recover it for her? And how, in heaven's name, could she know that the Moonstone would never be found again? As things stood, at present no answer to those questions was to be hoped for from anybody in the house. Mr. Franklin appeared to think it a point of honour to forbear repeating to a servant, even to so old a servant as I was, what Miss Rachel had said to him on the terrace. Mr. Godfrey, who, as a gentleman and a relative, had been probably admitted into Mr. Franklin's confidence, respected that confidence as he was bound to do. My lady, who was also in the secret no doubt, and who alone had access to Miss Rachel, owned openly that she could make nothing of her. "You madden me when you talk of the diamond." All her mother's influence failed to extract from her a word more than that. Here we were, then, at a deadlock about Miss Rachel, and at a deadlock about the Moonstone. In the first case my lady was powerless to help us. In the second, as you shall presently judge, Mr. Seagrave was fast approaching the condition of a superintendent at his wits' end. Having ferreted about all over the boudoir without making any discoveries among the furniture, our experienced officer applied to me to know whether the servants in general were or were not acquainted with the place in which the diamond had been put for the night. "I knew where it was put, sir," I said, "to begin with. Samuel the footman knew also, for he was present in the hall when they were talking about where the diamond was to be kept that night. My daughter knew, as she has already told you. She or Samuel may have mentioned the thing to the other servants, or the other servants may have heard the talk for themselves through the side door of the hall, which might have been open to the back staircase. For all I can tell, everybody in the house may have known where the jewel was last night." My answer presenting rather a wide field for Mr. Superintendent's suspicions to range over, he tried to narrow it by asking about the servants' characters next. "I thought directly of Rosanna Spearman. but it was neither my place nor my wish to direct suspicion against a poor girl whose honesty had been above all doubt as long as I had known her. The matron of the reformatory had reported her to my lady as a sincerely penitent and thoroughly trustworthy girl. It was the superintendent's business to discover reason for suspecting her first, and then, and not till then, it would be my duty to tell him how she came into my lady's service. "All our people have excellent characters," I said, "and all have deserved the trust their mistress has placed in them." After that there was but one thing left for Mr. Seagrave to do, namely to set to work and tackle the servants' characters himself. One after another they were examined. One after another they proved to have nothing to say, and said it, so far as the women were concerned, at great length, and with a very angry sense of the embargo laid on their bedrooms. The rest of them being sent back to their places downstairs, Penelope was then summoned and examined separately a second time. My daughter's little outbreak of temper in the boudoir, and her readiness to think herself suspected, appeared to have produced an unfavourable impression on Superintendent Seagrave. It seemed also to dwell a little on his mind that she had been the last person who saw the diamond at night. When the second questioning was over, my girl came back to me in a frenzy. There was no doubt of it any longer. The police officer had almost as good as told her she was the thief. I could scarcely believe him, taking Mr. Franklin's view, to be quite such an ass as that. But though he said nothing, the eye with which he looked at my daughter was not a very pleasant eye to see. I laughed it off with poor Penelope as something too ridiculous to be treated seriously, which it certainly was. Secretly, I am afraid, I was foolish enough to be angry too. It was a little trying, it was indeed. My girl sat down in a corner with her apron over her head, quite broken-hearted. Foolish of her, you will say. She might have waited till he openly accused her. Well, being a man of just and equal temper, I admit that. Still, Mr. Superintendent might have remembered. Never mind what he might have remembered. The devil take him. The next and last step in the investigation brought matters, as they say, to a crisis. The officer had an interview, at which I was present, with my lady. After informing her that the diamond must have been taken by somebody in the house, he requested permission for himself and his men to search the servants' rooms and boxes on the spot. My good mistress, like the generous high-bred woman she was, refused to let us be treated like thieves. "I will never consent to make such a return as that," she said, "for all I owe to the faithful servants who are employed in my house." Mr. Superintendent made his bow, with a look in my direction which said plainly, "Why employ me if you are to tie my hands in this way?" As head of the servants I felt directly that we were bound, in justice to all parties, not to profit by our mistress's generosity. "We gratefully thank your ladyship," I said, "but we ask permission to do what is right in this matter by giving up our keys. When Gabriel Betteridge sets the example," says I, stopping Superintendent Seagrave at the door, "the rest of the servants will follow, I promise you. There are my keys to begin with." My lady took me by the hand and thanked me with the tears in her eyes. Lord, what would I not have given at that moment for the privilege of knocking Superintendent Seagrave down! As I had promised for them, the other servants followed my lead, sorely against the grain, of course, but all taking the view that I took. The women were a sight to see while the police officers were rummaging among their things. The cook looked as if she could grill Mr. Superintendent alive on a furnace, and the other women looked as if they could eat him when he was done. The search over, and no diamond or sign of a diamond being found, of course, anywhere, Superintendent Seagrave retired to my little room to consider with himself what he was to do next. He and his men had now been hours in the house, and had not advanced us 1 inch towards a discovery of how the Moonstone had been taken, or of whom we were to suspect as the thief. While the police officer was still pondering in solitude, I was sent for to see Mr. Franklin in the library. To my unutterable astonishment, just as my hand was on the door, it was suddenly opened from the inside, and out walked Rosanna Spearman. After the library had been swept and cleaned in the morning, neither first nor second housemaid had any business in that room at any later period of the day. I stopped Rosanna Spearman and charged her with a breach of domestic discipline on the spot. "What might you want in the library at this time of day?" I inquired. "Mr. Franklin Blake dropped one of his rings upstairs," says Rosanna, "and I have been into the library to give it to him." The girl's face was all in a flush as she made me that answer, and she walked away with a toss of her head and a look of self-importance which I was quite at a loss to account for. The proceedings in the house had doubtless upset all the women servants more or less, but none of them had gone clean out of their natural characters, as Rosanna, to all appearance, had now gone out of hers. I found Mr. Franklin writing at the library table. He asked for a conveyance to the railway station the moment I entered the room. The first sound of his voice informed me that we now had the resolute side of him uppermost once more. The man made of cotton had disappeared, and the man made of iron sat before me again. "Going to London, sir?" I asked. "Going to telegraph to London," says Mr. Franklin. "I have convinced my aunt that we must have a cleverer head than Superintendent Seagrave's to help us, and I have got her permission to dispatch a telegram to my father. He knows the Chief Commissioner of Police, and the Commissioner can lay his hand on the right man to solve the mystery of the diamond. Talking of mysteries, by the by," says Mr. Franklin, dropping his voice, "I have another word to say to you before you go to the stables. Don't breathe a word of it to anybody as yet, but either Rosanna Spearman's head is not quite right, or I am afraid she knows more about the Moonstone than she ought to know." I can hardly tell whether I was more startled or distressed at hearing him say that. If I had been younger I might have confessed as much to Mr. Franklin, but when you are old you acquire one excellent habit. In cases where you don't see your way clearly, you hold your tongue. "She came in here with a ring I dropped in my bedroom," Mr. Franklin went on. "When I had thanked her, of course I expected her to go. Instead of that she stood opposite to me at the table, looking at me in the oddest manner, half frightened and half familiar. I couldn't make it out. 'This is a strange thing about the diamond, sir,' she said in a curiously sudden, headlong way. I said yes, it was, and wondered what was coming next. Upon my honour, Betteridge, I think she must be wrong in the head. She said, 'They will never find the diamond, sir, will they? No, nor the person who took it, I'll answer for that.' She actually nodded and smiled at me. Before I could ask her what she meant, we heard your step outside. I suppose she was afraid of your catching her here. At any rate, she changed colour and left the room. What on earth does it mean?" I could not bring myself to tell him the girl's story even then. It would have been almost as good as telling him that she was the thief. Besides, even if I had made a clean breast of it, and even supposing she was the thief, the reason why she should let out her secret to Mr. Franklin, of all the people in the world, would have been still as far to seek as ever. "I can't bear the idea of getting the poor girl into a scrape merely because she has a flighty way with her and talks very strangely," Mr. Franklin went on. And yet if she had said to the superintendent what she said to me, fool as he is, I'm afraid—" He stopped there and left the rest unspoken. "The best way, sir," I said, "will be for me to say 2 words privately to my mistress about it at the first opportunity. My lady has a very friendly interest in Rosanna, and the girl may only have been forward and foolish after all. When there's a mess of any kind in a house, sir, the women servants like to look at the gloomy side. It gives the poor wretches a kind of importance in their own eyes. If there's anybody ill, trust the women for prophesying that the person will die. If it's a jewel lost, trust them for prophesying that it will never be found again." This view, which I am bound to say I thought a probable view myself on reflection, seemed to relieve Mr. Franklin mightily. He folded up his telegram and dismissed the subject. On my way to the stables to order the pony chaise, I looked in at the servants' hall, where they were at dinner. Rosanna Spearman was not among them. On inquiry I found that she had been suddenly taken ill, and had gone upstairs to her own room to lie down. "Curious, she looked well enough when I saw her last," I remarked. Penelope followed me out. "Don't talk in that way before the rest of them, father," she said. "You only make them harder on Rosanna than ever. The poor thing is breaking her heart about Mr. Franklin Blake." Here was another view of the girl's conduct. If it was possible for Penelope to be right, the explanation of Rosanna's strange language and behaviour might have been all in this, that she didn't care what she said so long as she could surprise Mr. Franklin into speaking to her. Granting that to be the right reading of the riddle, it accounted perhaps for her flighty, self-conceited manner when she passed me in the hall. Though he had only said 3 words, still she had carried her point, and Mr. Franklin had spoken to her. I saw the pony harnessed myself. In the infernal network of mysteries and uncertainties that now surrounded us, I declare it was a relief to observe how well the buckles and straps understood each other. When you had seen the pony backed into the shafts of the chaise, you had seen something there was no doubt about, and that, let me tell you, was becoming a treat of the rarest kind in our household. Going round with the chaise to the front door, I found not only Mr. Franklin, but Mr. Godfrey and Superintendent Seagrave also waiting for me on the steps. Mr. Superintendent's reflections, after failing to find the diamond in the servants' rooms or boxes, had led him, it appeared, to an entirely new conclusion. Still sticking to his first text, namely that somebody in the house had stolen the jewel, our experienced officer was now of opinion that the thief — he was wise enough not to name poor Penelope, whatever he might privately think of her — had been acting in concert with the Indians, and he accordingly proposed shifting his inquiries to the jugglers in the prison at Frizinghall. Hearing of this new move, Mr. Franklin had volunteered to take the superintendent back to the town, from which he could telegraph to London as easily as from our station. Mr. Godfrey, still devoutly believing in Mr. Seagrave, and greatly interested in witnessing the examination of the Indians, had begged leave to accompany the officer to Frizinghall. One of the 2 inferior policemen was to be left at the house in case anything happened. The other was to go back with the superintendent to the town. So the 4 places in the pony chaise were just filled. Before he took the reins to drive off, Mr. Franklin walked me away a few steps, out of hearing of the others. "I will wait to telegraph to London," he said, "till I see what comes of our examination of the Indians. My own conviction is that this muddle-headed local police officer is as much in the dark as ever, and is simply trying to gain time. The idea of any of the servants being in league with the Indians is a preposterous absurdity, in my opinion. Keep about the house, Betteridge, till I come back, and try what you can make of Rosanna Spearman. I don't ask you to do anything degrading to your own self-respect, or anything cruel towards the girl. I only ask you to exercise your observation more carefully than usual. We will make as light of it as we can before my aunt, but this is a more important matter than you may suppose." "It is a matter of £20,000, sir," I said, thinking of the value of the diamond. "It's a matter of quieting Rachel's mind," answered Mr. Franklin gravely. "I am very uneasy about her." He left me suddenly, as if he desired to cut short any further talk between us. I thought I understood why. Further talk might have let me into the secret of what Miss Rachel had said to him on the terrace. So they drove away to Frizinghall. I was ready enough, in the girl's own interest, to have a little talk with Rosanna in private. But the needful opportunity failed to present itself. She only came downstairs again at tea-time. When she did appear she was flighty and excited, had what they call an hysterical attack, took a dose of sal volatile by my lady's order, and was sent back to her bed. The day wore on to its end drearily and miserably enough, I can tell you. Miss Rachel still kept her room, declaring that she was too ill to come down to dinner that day. My lady was in such low spirits about her daughter that I could not bring myself to make her additionally anxious by reporting what Rosanna Spearman had said to Mr. Franklin. Penelope persisted in believing that she was to be forthwith tried, sentenced, and transported for theft. The other women took to their Bibles and hymn-books, and looked as sour as verjuice over their reading, a result which I have observed in my sphere of life to follow generally on the performance of acts of piety at unaccustomed periods of the day. As for me, I hadn't even heart enough to open my Robinson Crusoe. I went out into the yard, and, being hard up for a little cheerful society, set my chair by the kennels and talked to the dogs. Half an hour before dinner-time the two gentlemen came back from Frizinghall, having arranged with Superintendent Seagrave that he was to return to us the next day. They had called on Mr. Murthwaite, the Indian traveller, at his present residence near the town. At Mr. Franklin's request he had kindly given them the benefit of his knowledge of the language in dealing with those 2 out of the 3 Indians who knew nothing of English. The examination, conducted carefully and at great length, had ended in nothing, not the shadow of a reason being discovered for suspecting the jugglers of having tampered with any of our servants. On reaching that conclusion, Mr. Franklin had sent his telegraphic message to London, and there the matter now rested till tomorrow came. So much for the history of the day that followed the birthday. Not a glimmer of light had broken in on us so far. A day or 2 after, however, the darkness lifted a little. How, and with what result, you shall presently see. End of chapter 11.
Moonstone, Part 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Gesine. Chapter 12. The Thursday night passed, and nothing happened. With the Friday morning came 2 pieces of news. Item the first: the baker's man declared he had met Rosanna Spearman on the previous afternoon with a thick veil on, walking towards Frizinghall by the footpath way over the moor. It seemed strange that anybody should be mistaken about Rosanna, whose shoulder marked her out pretty plainly, poor thing. But mistaken the man must have been, for Rosanna, as you know, had been all the Thursday afternoon ill upstairs in her room. Item the second came through the postman. Worthy Mr. Candy had said one more of his many unlucky things when he drove off in the rain on the birthday night, and told me that a doctor's skin was waterproof. In spite of his skin, the wet had got through him. He had caught a chill that night, and was now down with a fever. The last accounts, brought by the postman, represented him to be light-headed, talking nonsense as glibly, poor man, in his delirium as he often talked in his sober senses. We were all sorry for the little doctor, but Mr. Franklin appeared to regret his illness, chiefly on Miss Rachel's account. From what he said to my lady, while I was in the room at breakfast time, he appeared to think that Miss Rachel, if the suspense about the Moonstone was not soon set at rest, might stand in urgent need of the best medical advice at our disposal. Breakfast had not been over long when a telegram from Mr. Blake the elder arrived, in answer to his son. It informed us that he had laid hands, by help of his friend, the Commissioner, on the right man to help us. The name of him was Sergeant Cuff, and the arrival of him from London might be expected by the morning train. At reading the name of the new police officer, Mr. Franklin gave a start. It seems that he had heard some curious anecdotes about Sergeant Cuff from his father's lawyer during his stay in London. "I begin to hope we are seeing the end of our anxieties already," he said. "If half the stories I have heard are true, when it comes to unravelling a mystery there isn't the equal in England of Sergeant Cuff." We all got excited and impatient as the time drew near for the appearance of this renowned and capable character. Superintendent Seagrave, returning to us at his appointed time, and hearing that the sergeant was expected, instantly shut himself up in a room, with pen, ink, and paper, to make notes of the report which would be certainly expected from him. I should have liked to have gone to the station myself, to fetch the sergeant. But my lady's carriage and horses were not to be thought of, even for the celebrated Cuff, and the pony chaise was required later for Mr. Godfrey. He deeply regretted being obliged to leave his aunt at such an anxious time, and he kindly put off the hour of his departure till as late as the last train, for the purpose of hearing what the clever London police officer thought of the case. But on Friday night he must be in town, having a ladies' charity in difficulties waiting to consult him on Saturday morning. When the time came for the sergeant's arrival, I went down to the gate to look out for him. A fly from the railway drove up as I reached the lodge, and out got a grizzled, elderly man, so miserably lean that he looked as if he had not got an ounce of flesh on his bones in any part of him. He was dressed all in decent black, with a white cravat round his neck. His face was as sharp as a hatchet, and the skin of it was as yellow and dry and withered as an autumn leaf. His eyes, of a steely light grey, had a very disconcerting trick, when they encountered your eyes, of looking as if they expected something more from you than you were aware of yourself. His walk was soft, his voice was melancholy, his long lanky fingers were hooked like claws. He might have been a parson or an undertaker, or anything else you like, except what he really was. A more complete opposite to Superintendent Seagrave than Sergeant Cuff, and a less comforting officer to look at, for a family in distress, I defy you to discover, search where you may. "Is this Lady Verinder's?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I am Sergeant Cuff. This way, sir, if you please." On our road to the house, I mentioned my name and position in the family, to satisfy him that he might speak to me about the business on which my lady was to employ him. Not a word did he say about the business, however, for all that. He admired the grounds, and remarked that he felt the sea air very brisk and refreshing. I privately wondered, on my side, how the celebrated Cuff had got his reputation. We reached the house, in the temper of two strange dogs, coupled up together for the first time in their lives by the same chain. Asking for my lady, and hearing that she was in one of the conservatories, we went round to the gardens at the back, and sent a servant to seek her. While we were waiting, Sergeant Cuff looked through the evergreen arch on our left, spied out our rosary, and walked straight in, with the first appearance of anything like interest that he had shown yet. To the gardener's astonishment, and to my disgust, this celebrated policeman proved to be quite a mine of learning on the trumpery subject of rose gardens. "Ah, you've got the right exposure here to the south and sou'west," says the sergeant, with a wag of his grizzled head, and a streak of pleasure in his melancholy voice. "This is the shape for a rosary, nothing like a circle set in a square. Yes, yes, with walks between all the beds. But they oughtn't to be gravel walks like these. Grass, Mr. Gardener, grass walks between your roses. Gravel's too hard for them. That's a sweet, pretty bed of white roses and blush roses. They always mix well together, don't they? Here's the white musk rose, Mr. Betteridge, our old English rose, holding up its head along with the best and the newest of them." "Pretty dear," says the sergeant, fondling the musk rose with his lanky fingers and speaking to it as if he was speaking to a child. This was a nice sort of man to discover Miss Rachel's diamond, and to find out the thief who stole it. "You seem to be fond of roses, Sergeant," I remarked. "I haven't much time to be fond of anything," says Sergeant Cuff, "but when I have a moment's fondness to bestow, most times, Mr. Betteridge, the roses get it. I began my life among them in my father's nursery garden, and I shall end my life among them if I can. Yes, one of these days, please God, I shall retire from catching thieves, and try my hand at growing roses. There will be grass walks, Mr. Gardener, between my beds," says the sergeant, on whose mind the gravel paths of our rosary seemed to dwell unpleasantly. "It seems an odd taste, sir," I ventured to say, "for a man in your line of life." "If you will look about you, which most people won't do," says Sergeant Cuff, "you will see that the nature of a man's tastes is, most times, as opposite as possible to the nature of a man's business. Show me any two things more opposite, one from the other, than a rose and a thief, and I'll correct my tastes accordingly, if it isn't too late at my time of life. You find the damask rose a goodish stock for most of the tender sorts, don't you, Mr. Gardener? Ah, I thought so. Here's a lady coming. Is it Lady Verinder?" He had seen her before either I or the gardener had seen her, though we knew which way to look, and he didn't. I began to think him rather a quicker man than he appeared to be at first sight. The sergeant's appearance, or the sergeant's errand, one or both, seemed to cause my lady some little embarrassment. She was, for the first time in all my experience of her, at a loss what to say at an interview with a stranger. Sergeant Cuff put her at her ease directly. He asked if any other person had been employed about the robbery before we sent for him, and hearing that another person had been called in, and was now in the house, begged leave to speak with him before anything else was done. My lady led the way back. Before he followed her, the sergeant relieved his mind on the subject of the gravel walks by a parting word to the gardener. "Get her ladyship to try grass," he said, with a sour look at the paths. "No gravel, no gravel." Why Superintendent Seagrave should have appeared to be several sizes smaller than life on being presented to Sergeant Cuff, I can't undertake to explain. I can only state the fact. They retired together and remained a weary long time shut up from all mortal intrusion. When they came out, Mr. Superintendent was excited, and Mr. Sergeant was yawning. "The sergeant wishes to see Miss Verinder's sitting-room," says Mr. Seagrave, addressing me with great pomp and eagerness. "The sergeant may have some questions to ask. Attend the sergeant, if you please." While I was being ordered about in this way, I looked at the great Cuff. The great Cuff, on his side, looked at Superintendent Seagrave in that quietly expecting way which I have already noticed. I can't affirm that he was on the watch for his brother officer's speedy appearance in the character of an ass. I can only say that I strongly suspected it. I led the way upstairs. The sergeant went softly all over the Indian cabinet and all round the boudoir, asking questions, occasionally only of Mr. Superintendent and continually of me. the drift of which I believe to have been equally unintelligible to both of us. In due time, his course brought him to the door, and put him face to face with a decorative painting that you know of. He laid one lean inquiring finger on the small smear, just under the lock, which Superintendent Seagrave had already noticed, when he reproved the women servants for all crowding together into the room. "That's a pity," says Sergeant Cuff. "How did it happen?" He put the question to me. I answered that the women servants had crowded into the room on the previous morning, and that some of their petticoats had done the mischief. "Superintendent Seagrave ordered them out, sir," I added, "before they did any more harm." "Right," says Mr. Superintendent in his military way. "I ordered them out. The petticoats did it, Sergeant. The petticoats did it." "Did you notice which petticoat did it?" asked Sergeant Cuff, still addressing himself not to his brother officer, but to me. "No, sir." He turned to Superintendent Seagrave upon that, and said, "You noticed, I suppose?" Mr. Superintendent looked a little taken aback, but he made the best of it. "I can't charge my memory, Sergeant," he said. "A mere trifle, a mere trifle." Sergeant Cuff looked at Mr. Seagrave as he had looked at the gravel walks and the rosary, and gave us, in his melancholy way, the first taste of his quality which we had had yet. "I made a private inquiry last week, Mr. Superintendent," he said. "At one end of the inquiry there was a murder, and at the other end there was a spot of ink on a tablecloth that nobody could account for. In all my experience along the dirtiest ways of this dirty little world, I have never met with such a thing as a trifle yet. Before we go a step further in this business we must see the petticoat that made the smear, and we must know for certain when that paint was wet." Mr. Superintendent, taking his set down rather sulkily, asked if he should summon the women. Sergeant Cuff, after considering a minute, sighed and shook his head. "No," he said. "We'll take the matter of the paint first. It's a question of yes or no with the paint, which is short. It's a question of petticoats with the women, which is long. What o'clock was it when the servants were in this room yesterday morning? 11 o'clock, eh? Is there anybody in the house who knows whether that paint was wet or dry at 11 yesterday morning?" "Her ladyship's nephew, Mr. Franklin Blake, knows," I said. "Is the gentleman in the house?" Mr. Franklin was as close at hand as could be, waiting for his first chance of being introduced to the great Cuff. In half a minute he was in the room, and was giving his evidence as follows. "The door, Sergeant," he said, "has been painted by Miss Verinder, under my inspection, with my help, and in a vehicle of my own composition. The vehicle dries whatever colours may be used with it, in 12 hours. "Do you remember when the smeared bit was done, sir?" asked the sergeant. "Perfectly," answered Mr. Franklin. "That was the last morsel of the door to be finished. We wanted to get it done on Wednesday last, and I myself completed it by 3 in the afternoon, or soon after." "Today is Friday," said Sergeant Cuff, addressing himself to Superintendent Seagrave. "Let us reckon back, sir. At 3 on the Wednesday afternoon that bit of the painting was completed. The vehicle dried it in 12 hours, that is to say, dried it by 3 o'clock on Thursday morning. At 11 on Thursday morning you held your inquiry here. Take 3 hours from 11 and 8 remains. That paint had been 8 hours dry, Mr. Superintendent, when you supposed that the women servants' petticoats smeared it." First knockdown blow for Mr. Seagrave. If he had not suspected poor Penelope, I should have pitied him. Having settled the question of the paint, Sergeant Cuff, from that moment, gave his brother officer up as a bad job, and addressed himself to Mr. Franklin as the more promising assistant of the two. "It's quite on the cards, sir," he said, "that you have put the clue into our hands." As the words passed his lips, the bedroom door opened, and Miss Rachel came out among us suddenly. She addressed herself to the sergeant without appearing to notice or to heed that he was a perfect stranger to her. "Did you say," she asked, pointing to Mr. Franklin, "that he had put the clue into your hands?" "This is Miss Verinder," I whispered, behind the sergeant. "That gentleman, miss, said the sergeant, with his steely grey eyes carefully studying my young lady's face, has possibly put the clue into our hands. She turned for one moment and tried to look at Mr. Franklin. I say tried, for she suddenly looked away again before their eyes met. There seemed to be some strange disturbance in her mind. She coloured up, and then she turned pale again. With the paleness there came a new look into her face, a look which it startled me to see. "Having answered your question, miss," says the sergeant, "I beg leave to make an inquiry in my turn. There is a smear on the painting of your door here. Do you happen to know when it was done, or who did it?" Instead of making any reply, Miss Rachel went on with her questions as if he had not spoken, or as if she had not heard him. "Are you another police officer?" she asked. "I am Sergeant Cuff, miss, of the detective police." "Do you think a young lady's advice worth having?" "I shall be glad to hear it, miss." "Do your duty by yourself, and don't allow Mr. Franklin Blade to help you." She said those words so spitefully, so savagely, with such an extraordinary outbreak of ill will towards Mr. Franklin, in her voice and in her look, that, although I had known her myself from a baby, though I loved and honoured her next to my lady herself, I was ashamed of Miss Rachel for the first time in my life. Sergeant Cuff's immovable eyes never stirred from off her face. "Thank you, miss," he said. "Do you happen to know anything about the smear? Might you have done it by accident yourself?" "I know nothing about the smear." With that answer she turned away, and shut herself up again in her bedroom. This time I heard her, as Penelope had heard her before, burst out crying as soon as she was alone again. I couldn't bring myself to look at the sergeant. I looked at Mr. Franklin, who stood nearest to me. He seemed to be even more sorely distressed at what had passed than I was. "I told you I was uneasy about her," he said, "and now you see why." "Miss Verinder appears to be a little out of temper about the loss of her diamond," remarked the sergeant. "It's a valuable jewel. Natural enough, natural enough." Here was the excuse that I had made for her, when she forgot herself before Superintendent Seagrave on the previous day, being made for her over again by a man who couldn't have had my interest in making it, for he was a perfect stranger. A kind of cold shudder ran through me, which I couldn't account for at the time. I know now that I must have got my first suspicion, at that moment, of a new light, and a horrid light, having suddenly fallen on the case in the mind of Sergeant Cuff, purely and entirely in consequence of what he had seen in Miss Rachel, and heard from Miss Rachel, at that first interview between them. "A young lady's tongue is a privileged member, sir," says the sergeant to Mr. Franklin. "Let us forget what has passed, and go straight on with this business. Thanks to you, we know when the paint was dry. The next thing to discover is when the paint was last seen without that smear. You have got a head on your shoulders, and you understand what I mean." Mr. Franklin composed himself, and came back with an effort from Miss Rachel to the matter in hand. "I think I do understand," he said. "The more we narrow the question of time, the more we also narrow the field of inquiry." "That's it, sir," said the sergeant. "Did you notice your work here, on the Wednesday afternoon after you had done it?" Mr. Franklin shook his head and answered, "I can't say I did." "Did you?" inquired Sergeant Cuff, turning to me. "I can't say I did either, sir." "Who was the last person in the room, the last thing on Wednesday night?" "Miss Rachel, I suppose, sir." Mr. Franklin struck in there. "Or possibly your daughter, Betteridge." He turned to Sergeant Cuff and explained that my daughter was Miss Verinder's maid. "Mr. Betteridge, ask your daughter to step up. Stop!" says the sergeant, taking me away to the window, out of earshot. "Your superintendent here," he went on, in a whisper, "has made a pretty full report to me of the manner in which he has managed the case. Among other things he has, by his own confession, set the servants back up. It's very important to smooth them down again. Tell your daughter and tell the rest of them these two things with my compliments. First, that I have no evidence before me yet that the diamond has been stolen. I only know that the diamond has been lost. Second, that my business here with the servants is simply to ask them to lay their heads together and help me to find it. My experience of the women servants, when Superintendent Seagrave laid his embargo on their rooms, came in handy here. May I make so bold, Sergeant, as to tell the women a third thing? I asked. Are they free, with your compliments, to fidget up and downstairs, and whisk in and out of their bedrooms, if the fit takes them? Perfectly free, said the sergeant. That will smooth them down, sir, I remarked, from the cook to the scullion. Go and do it at once, Mr. Betteridge. I did it in less than 5 minutes. There was only one difficulty when it came to the bit about the bedrooms. It took a pretty stiff exertion of my authority as chief to prevent the whole of the female household from following me and Penelope upstairs in the character of volunteer witnesses in a burning fever of anxiety to help Sergeant Cuff. The sergeant seemed to approve of Penelope. He became a trifle less dreary, and he looked much as he had looked when he noticed the white musk rose in the flower garden. Here is my daughter's evidence as drawn off from her by the sergeant. She gave it, I think, very prettily. But there, she is my child all over. Nothing of her mother in her. Lord bless you, nothing of her mother in her. Penelope examined. Took a lively interest in the painting on the door, having helped to mix the colours. Noticed the bit of work under the lock, because it was the last bit done. Had seen it, some hours afterwards, without the smear. Had left it, as late as 12 at night, without a smear. Had, at that hour, wished her young lady good night in the bedroom. Had heard the clock strike in the boudoir. Had her hand on the time, on the handle of the painted door. Knew the paint was wet, having helped to mix the colours, as aforesaid. Took particular pains not to touch it. Could swear that she had held up the skirts of her dress, and that there was no smear on the paint then. Could not swear that her dress mightn't have touched it accidentally in going out. Remembered the dress she had on because it was new, a present from Miss Rachel. Her father remembered and could speak to it, too. Could and would and did fetch it. Dress recognized by her father as the dress she wore that night. Skirts examined. A long job from the size of them. Not the ghost of a paint stain discovered anywhere. End of Penelope's evidence, and very pretty and convincing too. Signed Gabriel Betteridge. The sergeant's next proceeding was to question me about any large dogs in the house, who might have got into the room and done the mischief with a whisk of their tails. Hearing that this was impossible, he next sent for a magnifying glass, and tried how the smear looked, seen that way. No skin mark, as of a human hand, printed off on the paint. All the signs visible, signs which told that the paint had been smeared by some loose article of somebody's dress touching it in going by. That somebody, putting together Penelope's evidence and Mr. Franklin's evidence, must have been in the room and done the mischief between midnight and 3 o'clock on the Thursday morning. Having brought his investigation to this point, Sergeant Cuff discovered that such a person as Superintendent Seagrave was still left in the room, upon which he summoned up the proceedings for his brother officer's benefit, as follows. "This trifle of yours, Mr. Superintendent," says the sergeant, pointing to the place on the door, "has grown a little in importance since you noticed it last. At the present stage of the inquiry there are, as I take it, 3 discoveries to make, starting from that smear. Find out, first, whether there is any article of dress in this house with the smear of the paint on it. Find out, second, who that dress belongs to. Find out, third, how the person can account for having been in this room, and smear the paint between midnight and 3 in the morning. If the person can't satisfy you, you haven't far to look for the hand that has got the diamond. I'll work this by myself, if you please, and detain you no longer from your regular business in the town. You have got one of your men here, I see. Leave him here at my disposal in case I want him, and allow me to wish you good morning." Superintendent Seagrave's respect for the sergeant was great, but his respect for himself was greater still. Hit hard by the celebrated Cuff, he hit back smartly, to the best of his ability, on leaving the room. "I have abstained from expressing any opinion so far," says Mr. Superintendent, with his military voice still in good working order. "I have now only one remark to offer on leaving this case in your hands. There is such a thing, Sergeant, as making a mountain out of a molehill. Good morning." "There is also such a thing as making nothing out of a molehill in consequence of your head being too high to see it." Having returned his brother officer's compliments in those terms, Sergeant Cuff wheeled about and walked away to the window by himself. Mr. Franklin and I waited to see what was coming next. The sergeant stood at the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out and whistling the tune of "The Last Rose of Summer" softly to himself. Later in the proceedings I discovered that he only forgot his manners so far as to whistle, when his mind was hard at work, seeing its way inch by inch to its own private ends, on which occasions "The Last Rose of Summer" evidently helped and encouraged him. I suppose it fitted in somehow with his character. It reminded him, you see, of his favourite roses, and as he whistled it, it was the most melancholy tune going. Turning from the window, after a minute or two, the sergeant walked into the middle of the room and stopped there, deep in thought, with his eyes on Miss Rachel's bedroom door. After a little he roused himself, nodded his head, as much as to say, "That will do," and addressing me, asked for 10 minutes' conversation with my mistress, at her ladyship's earliest convenience. Leaving the room with this message, I heard Mr. Franklin ask the sergeant a question, and stopped to hear the answer, also at the threshold of the door. "Can you guess yet," inquired Mr. Franklin, "who has stolen the diamond?" "Nobody has stolen the diamond," answered Sergeant Cuff. We both stared at that extraordinary view of the case, and both earnestly begged him to tell us what he meant. "Wait a little," said the sergeant. "The pieces of the puzzle are not all put together yet." End of chapter 12. Recorded by Gesine in August 2007. Part 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. Read by Gesine. Chapter 13. I found my lady in her own sitting room. She started and looked annoyed when I mentioned that Sergeant Cuff wished to speak to her. "Must I see him?" she asked. "Can't you represent me, Gabriel?" I felt at a loss to understand this, and showed it plainly, I suppose, in my face. My lady was so good as to explain herself. "I am afraid my nerves are a little shaken," she said. "There is something in that police officer from London which I recoil from. I don't know why. I have a presentiment that he is bringing trouble and misery with him into the house. Very foolish and very unlike me, but so it is." I hardly knew what to say to this. The more I saw of Sergeant Cuff, the better I liked him. My lady rallied a little after having opened her heart to me, being, naturally, a woman of high courage, as I have already told you. "If I must see him, I must," she said. "But I can't prevail on myself to see him alone. Bring him in, Gabriel, and stay here as long as he stays." This was the first attack of the megrims that I remembered in my mistress since the time when she was a young girl. I went back to the boudoir. Mr. Franklin strolled out into the garden, and joined Mr. Godfrey, whose time for departure was now drawing near. Sergeant Cuff and I went straight to my mistress's room. I declare that my lady turned a shade paler at the sight of him. She commanded herself, however, in other respects, and asked the sergeant if he had any objection to my being present. She was so good as to add that I was her trusted adviser, as well as her old servant, and that in anything which related to the household I was the person whom it might be most profitable to consult. The sergeant politely answered that he would take my presence as a favour, having something to say about the servants in general, and having found my experience in that quarter already of some use to him. My lady pointed to 2 chairs, and we set in for our conference immediately. "I have already formed an opinion on this case," says Sergeant Cuff, "which I beg your ladyship's permission to keep to myself for the present. My business now is to mention what I have discovered upstairs, in Miss Verinder's sitting-room, and what I have decided, with your ladyship's leave, on doing next." He then went into the matter of the smear on the paint, and stated the conclusions he drew from it, just as he had stated them, only with greater respect of language, to Superintendent Seagrave. "One thing," he said in conclusion, "is certain. The diamond is missing out of the drawer in the cabinet. Another thing is next to certain. The marks from the smear on the door must be on some article of dress belonging to somebody in this house. We must discover that article of dress before we go a step further." "And that discovery," remarked my mistress, "implies, I presume, the discovery of the thief?" "I beg your ladyship's pardon. I don't say the diamond is stolen. I only say at present that the diamond is missing. The discovery of the stained dress may lead the way to finding it." Her ladyship looked at me. "Do you understand this?" she said. "Sergeant Cuff understands it, my lady," I answered. "How do you propose to discover the stained dress?" inquired my mistress, addressing herself once more to the sergeant. "My good servants, who have been with me for years, have, I am ashamed to say, had their boxes and rooms searched already by the other officer. I can't and won't permit them to be insulted in that way a second time." There was a mistress to serve. There was a woman in 10,000, if you like. "That is the very point I was about to put to your ladyship," said the sergeant. "The other officer has done a world of harm to this inquiry, by letting the servants see that he suspected them. If I give them cause to think themselves suspected a second time, there's no knowing what obstacles they may not throw in my way, the women especially. At the same time, their boxes must be searched again, for this plain reason, that the first investigation only looked for the diamond, and that the second investigation must look for the stained dress. I quite agree with you, my lady, that the servants' feelings ought to be consulted. But I am equally clear that the servants' wardrobes ought to be searched." This looked very like a deadlock. My lady said so, in choicer language than mine. "I have got a plan to meet the difficulty," said Sergeant Cuff, "if your ladyship will consent to it. I propose explaining the case to the servants." "The women will think themselves suspected directly," I said, interrupting him. "The women won't, Mr. Betteredge," answered the sergeant. "If I can tell them I am going to examine the wardrobes of everybody, from her ladyship downwards, who slept in the house on Wednesday night. It's a mere formality," he added with a side look at my mistress, "but the servants will accept it as even dealing between them and their betters, and instead of hindering the investigation, they will make it a point of honour of assisting it." I saw the truth of that. My lady, after her first surprise was over, saw the truth of it also. "You are certain the investigation is necessary?" she said. "It's the shortest way I can see, my lady, to the end we have in view." My mistress rose to ring the bell for her maid. "You shall speak to the servants," she said, with the keys of my wardrobe in your hand." Sergeant Cuff stopped her by a very unexpected question. "Hadn't we better make sure first," he asked, "that the other ladies and gentlemen in the house will consent too?" "The only other lady in the house is Miss Verinder," answered my mistress with a look of surprise. "The only gentlemen are my nephews, Mr. Blake and Mr. Ablewhite. There is not the least fear of a refusal from any of the three." I reminded my lady here that Mr. Godfrey was going away. As I said the words, Mr. Godfrey himself knocked at the door to say good-bye, and was followed in by Mr. Franklin, who was going with him to the station. My lady explained the difficulty. Mr. Godfrey settled it directly. He called to Samuel, through the window, to take his portmanteau upstairs again, and he then put the key himself into Sergeant Cuff's hand. "My luggage can follow me to London," he said, "when the inquiry is over." The sergeant received the key with a becoming apology. "I am sorry to put you to any inconvenience, sir, for a mere formality, but the example of their betters will do wonders in reconciling the servants to this inquiry." Mr. Godfrey, after taking leave of my lady in a most sympathizing manner, left a farewell message for Miss Rachel, the terms of which made it clear to my mind that he had not taken no for an answer, and that he meant to put the marriage question to her once more at the next opportunity. Mr. Franklin, on following his cousin out, informed the sergeant that all his clothes were open to examination, and that nothing he possessed was kept under lock and key. Sergeant Cuff made his best acknowledgments. His views, you will observe, had been met with the utmost readiness by my lady, by Mr. Godfrey, and by Mr. Franklin. There was only Miss Rachel now wanting to follow their lead, before we called the servants together, and began the search for the stained dress. My lady's unaccountable objection to the sergeant seemed to make our conference more distasteful to her than ever, as soon as we were left alone again. "If I send you down Miss Verinder's keys," she said to him, "I presume I shall have done all you want of me for the present?" "I beg your ladyship's pardon," said Sergeant Cuff. "Before we begin, I would like, if convenient, to have the washing book. The stained article of dress may be an article of linen. If the search leads to nothing, I want to be able to account next for all the linen in the house, and for all the linen sent to the wash. If there is an article missing, there will be at least a presumption that it has got the paint stain on it, and that it has been purposely made away with, yesterday or today, by the person owning it. Superintendent Seagrave," added the sergeant, turning to me, "pointed the attention of the women servants to the smear, when they all crowded into the room on Thursday morning. That may turn out, Mr. Betteridge, to have been one more of Superintendent Seagrave's many mistakes." My lady desired me to ring the bell, and order the washing book. She remained with us until it was produced, in case Sergeant Cuff had any further request to make of her, after looking at it. The washing book was brought in by Rosanna Spearman. The girl had come down to breakfast that morning miserably pale and haggard, but sufficiently recovered from her illness of the previous day to do her usual work. Sergeant Cuff looked attentively at our second housemaid, at her face when she came in, at her crooked shoulder when she went out. "Have you anything more to say to me?" asked my lady, still as eager as ever to be out of the sergeant's society. The great Cuff opened the washing book, understood it perfectly in half a minute, and shut it up again. "I venture to trouble your ladyship with one last question," he said. "Has the young woman who brought us this book been in your employment as long as the other servants?" "Why do you ask?" said my lady. "The last time I saw her," answered the sergeant, "she was in prison for theft." After that, there was no help for it but to tell him the truth. My mistress dwelt strongly on Rosanna's good conduct in her service, and on the high opinion entertained of her by the matron at the reformatory. "You don't suspect her, I hope," my lady added in conclusion, very earnestly. "I have already told your ladyship that I don't suspect any person in the house of thieving, up to the present time." After that answer, my lady rose to go upstairs and ask for Miss Rachel's keys. The sergeant was beforehand with me in opening the door for her. He made a very low bow. My lady shuddered as she passed him. We waited and waited, and no keys appeared. Sergeant Cuff made no remark to me. He turned his melancholy face to the window, he put his lanky hands into his pockets, and he whistled "The Last Rose of Summer" softly to himself. At last Samuel came in, not with the keys, but with a morsel of paper for me. I got at my spectacles, with some fumbling and difficulty, feeling the sergeant's dismal eyes fixed on me all the time. There were 2 or 3 lines on the paper, written in pencil by my lady. They informed me that Miss Rachel flatly refused to have her wardrobe examined. Asked for her reasons, she had burst out crying. Asked again, she had said, "I won't because I won't. I must yield to force if you use it, but I will yield to nothing else." I understood my lady's disinclination to face Sergeant Cuff with such an answer from her daughter as that. If I had not been too old for the amiable weaknesses of youth, I believe I should have blushed at the notion of facing him myself. "Any news of Miss Verinder's keys?" asked the sergeant. "My young lady refuses to have her wardrobe examined." "Ah," said the sergeant. His voice was not quite in such a perfect state of discipline as his face. When he said "Ah," he said it in the tone of a man who had heard something which he expected to hear. He half angered and half frightened me. Why, I couldn't tell, but he did it. "Must the search be given up?" I asked. "Yes," said the sergeant, "the search must be given up, because your young lady refuses to submit to it like the rest. We must examine all the wardrobes in the house, or none. Send Mr. Abel White's portmanteau to London by the next train, and return the washing book, with my compliments and thanks, to the young woman who brought it in." He laid the washing book on the table, and turning out his penknife, began to trim his nails. "You don't seem to be much disappointed," I said. "No," said Sergeant Cuff, "I am not much disappointed." I tried to make him explain himself. "Why should Miss Rachel put an obstacle in your way?" I inquired. "Isn't it her best interest to help you?" "Wait a little, Mr. Betteredge. Wait a little." Cleverer heads than mine might have seen his drift. Or a person less fond of Miss Rachel than I was might have seen his drift. My lady's horror of him might, as I have since thought, have meant that she saw his drift, as the scripture says, "in a glass darkly." I didn't see it yet, that's all I know. "What's to be done next?" I asked. Sergeant Cuff finished the nail on which he was then at work, looked at it for a moment with a melancholy interest, and put up his penknife. "Come out into the garden," he said, "and let's have a look at the roses." End of chapter 13. Recorded by Gesine in May 2007.